The American Revolution was the defining moment for the 13 colonies as they moved toward freedom from England. Going into the Revolution, both the English and Americans had strengths and weaknesses. For the Americans, the soldiers were fighting on their own territory, giving them the advantage of knowing the land better than the British. The Americans also broke away from European rules of warfare, where opposing sides would stand face to face and shoot at each other. Instead, the Americans used guerrilla tactics, utilizing hit and run instead of fighting face to face. Another advantage for the Americans included their allies. Both the French and the Spanish, both of whom had their own issues with the British, chose to fight on the side of the Americans. Finally, one of the most significant for the Americans was the fact that they were fighting for their freedom. The Americans had a lot to gain and a lot to lose. This provided them with the push to fight harder and be less inclined to give up easily. The British had their own advantages, including being the most powerful military in the world, with more experience in warfare than the Americans. However, at the time, England had been economically weakened by a series of wars they had recently endured. With lack of finances and resources, the British would find it hard to supply their troops fighting against the Americans. Finally, due to their power, many of the officers were overconfident. They did not expect the American soldiers to be as dedicated, which assisted in American victory. At the beginning of the war, it was decided that George Washington would become the commander of the Continental Army. At first, men would enlist for 1 year and then go home. This proved to be problematic, as the number of soldiers was already small, having no more than 17,000 men. The smaller number was also largely due to the fact that supplies were in high demand and short supply. There was a large need for guns, ammunition, and training. Women provided their own help by being cooks, doing laundry, nursing, and some would even fight in disguise. One such female fighter included Deborah Sampson, who served for a year in New York under the name Robert Shirley. Another included Mad Ann Bailey, who initially worked as a scout and a messenger. She is most remembered for her 100-mile ride from Fort Clendenin to Fort Savannah to bring back gunpowder. Bailey began wearing men's clothing and taught herself how to shoot a gun. Bailey enlisted in the military and reached the rank of corporal before she was discovered to be a woman. As with all wars, armies need leaders. On the American side, General George Washington oversaw the American Army. General Henry Knox was in charge of the artillery. General Horatio Gates was in charge of the Southern Army, as well as Nathaniel Greene. Frenchman Marquis de Lafayette played a crucial role as field commander, as well as helped obtain aid from France. On the British side, Lord Charles Cornwallis attempted to unsuccessfully retake Trenton and capture General George Washington. Sir William Howe was the major general at Bunker Hill, while Sir Henry Clinton led troops through the South to gather support. John Burgoyne created a plan to cut off the colonies from each other in order to weaken them. Thomas Gage, British commander and last royal governor of Massachusetts, was relieved of his command after Bunker Hill. The weapons of the Revolution played an integral role in both the successes and failures on both sides. The weapons at the time were very primitive, time-consuming, and inaccurate. The British flintlock musket was known as Brown Bess. Attached to many muskets were bayonets, used to stab the opponent. Used primarily by officers and cavalry was the cavalry sword. Along with guns was the hollow-shot cannonball. The ball was filled with gunpowder with a fuse put on as the detonator. The grenade was a smaller version of the hollow shot. The solid-shot cannonball was used to roll through the ranks, killing and maiming soldiers. The grape shot was a bag filled with lead balls that was shot at the enemy. The difficulty with the musket was that it would take time to fire one shot. A good soldier would get 3 shots off in 1 minute.
The soldier can learn. New recruits are taught the loading procedure in 9 counts. Prepare to load. Load. Handle cartridge. Tear cartridge. Charge cartridge. Draw rammer. Ram cartridge. Return rammer. Prime. Shoulder arms. Ready? Aim. Fire. Having the sequence well drilled into the soldier means fewer mistakes and more firepower on the line. A A veteran soldier can load and fire 3 aimed shots per minute.
For the cannon, multiple soldiers were needed to clean out and load the cannon. The Revolutionary War involved a different form of warfare. While the British used linear warfare, the Americans used guerrilla. Linear warfare was the European style. It was used because of the inaccuracy of the guns. If the soldiers are lined up, then you can rely less on aiming at the enemy. Soldiers would fire at the same time, hoping to take out as many soldiers as possible. After 4 to 5 shots, soldiers would have to attach the bayonet and fight hand-to-hand. This was mainly due to the fact that the barrel would heat up to the point where it could not be loaded by hand. Guerrilla warfare is the use of sneak or ambush attack. This was seen by the British as dishonorable. The most famous soldier who used guerrilla warfare during the Revolution was Francis Marion. Known as the Swamp Fox, Marion would use hit-and-run tactics against the British, then retreat to his base in the South Carolina swamps. While many battles took place during the American Revolution, the following battles were some of the most significant in the war. Lexington and Concord are considered the first battle of the Revolutionary War, the place where the phrase "the shot heard round the world" originated. On April 19, 1775, the British marched toward Concord in an effort to capture weapons from the militia. Paul Revere and William Dawes helped to warn of the British approach, the event that had Revere incorrectly stating, "The British are coming." The truth is, they were all British, so that would have been a bit confusing. However, he did yell, "The regulars are coming," in order to warn the colonists. The British reached Lexington Green and were met by the militia. Still unknown to this day, someone began firing and the militia retreated. The British continued marching on, reached Concord, and set the supplies on fire. Because information did not travel as fast back then as it does today, the militia believed they had burned the town. This infuriated the militia, and they ambushed the British as they marched back to Boston. When the smoke cleared, 250 British were killed. By April 20th, 15,000 men arrived to help the militia surround Boston as a means to prevent the British from moving in. The British set Bunker and Breed's Hill as the first target to reclaim control of the area. The militia held the hill first at a safe distance from any attack by the British. Then, the militia learned the British planned to attack the hill. The militia's plan was to set up at Bunker Hill, but chose Breed's Hill instead because it was closer to the city. This was a bad decision, because the British was able to bombard the militia. However, the British had difficulty climbing the hill. The militia's tactic was to hold fire until the British were close enough. The British were pushed back 2 times before they regrouped and created a new formation. The militia, at this point, had run out of ammunition and were forced to rely on throwing rocks. Ultimately, the colonists were forced to retreat and the British were victorious. However, the question of who won is a matter of perspective. While the British won the land, they had lost 1,100 soldiers compared to the militia losing only 450. The militia would use Bunker Hill as a rallying cry for other battles in the future. The following month, in July of 1775, the Continental Congress attempted one last time to work with England with the Olive Branch Petition. King George III refused to look at it and declared the Americans to be in an open state of rebellion. The colonists finally realized there was no going back to being one with Britain, and that the only other option was independence. From August to October 1776, the British pushed forward to subdue the colonies. This began with an effort to recapture New York. First, the British were able to drive General George Washington to White Plains, New York, being followed by the British. White Plains was the first time Washington was able to hold off the British forces. However, the British were able to outmaneuver Washington, forcing Washington to retreat to New Jersey. In December of 1776, the American army was at a low point. General Washington's men's enlistment was about to expire, forcing Washington to attempt to make a quick victory to raise morale of the soldiers and the colonies. On December 25th, the American army crossed the ice-filled Delaware River and led a surprise attack on the Hessian regiment occupying the city of Trenton. The Hessians were caught off guard and were defeated in 30 minutes. The Americans were able to capture much-needed supplies, including more than 50 artillery pieces. Hessians were German troops who fought for the British. Over 30,000 German soldiers fought for the British. They fought in their own traditional uniforms under their own officers and flags, even though they were under the command of the British generals. In January of 1777, Washington planned to move around the British forces in a flanking maneuver to attack from the rear. The attack took place in an orchard outside of Princeton, New Jersey. Initially, the attack was led by Hugh Mercer, who was overrun and eventually killed. Washington realized he had to rally his men. riding on his horse between the lines of fire. When the smoke cleared, Washington was untouched, and the Americans were able to force the British from the field. In October of 1777, Washington saw one last chance to defeat the British at Germantown, Pennsylvania. Washington attempted to outflank the British. The Americans were able to hold up about 150 British soldiers as the British ran into a large stone house called the Chew House. The British were able to hold off the Americans until the attacks began to fizzle. The Americans were forced to withdraw to Valley Forge for the winter. In the 18th century, armies did not fight in the winter for a number of reasons. First, there were no paved roads, so transporting men and goods would be impossible on muddy or snow-covered roads. Second, armies relied on crops growing in the fields to feed the men, which were not available during the wintertime. Valley Forge, a military camp, was where George Washington and his men waited out the winter. Washington used this time off to train his troops. He brought in Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former general staff from Prussia. Von Steuben offered his military skills without pay as a means to assist Washington and his men. During the winter at Valley Forge, 1/4 of the troops died from disease and starvation. Even through this tough time, most of the soldiers decided to stay, mainly due to their respect and dedication to Washington.